Hello students, welcome back to the biology revision class. Today we are going to revise the last chapter from grade 11 on topic energy transformation and subtopic respiration. Stay tuned. As you know that living organisms in this world, they require energy to do their life activities. So how do the cells are capturing, or living organisms in general capture their energy or obtain their energy? But before we look at the way how living organisms obtain the energy, let's see some examples of energy transformation. Energy, always neither created nor destroyed. It exists always. It can transform from one form to another. For example, you have a light energy. The light energy through the photosynthetic process, it converted into a chemical energy. Inside living organisms, that is the green plants. Different kinds of plants are there, so they can carry out photosynthesis. Obviously, you know the process of photosynthesis. So the light energy is converted into chemical energy. You have also electrical energy in your home. This electrical energy is converted from electrons to that of a kind of light, or it can be converted into heat energy or light energy, or cooling energy in your home around. So this is one kind of energy transformation. And again, if you have a dry cell, for instance, in a dry cell has an energy. This energy is stored in a form of chemical energy. So in a dry cell, you can use this dry cell for your radio transmitter, or you can use for your hand torch or torchlight. So in a radio, the energy in the dry cell is converted into sound energy, or in your torch, it is converted into light energy. So this is what we mean by energy transformation. In living world, energy is transformed into chemical energy. So this chemical energy binded in different molecules, in the carbohydrate, protein, fats, and the likes. These are different organic molecules are binding the light energy. How that this energy is released and utilized by the cell. This is the main point of our discussion today. And the mechanism by which energy is released is respiration. So we're going to look at about the respiration process and the molecule which is very important. That is the form of energy that is utilized by the cell, the Atp molecule. So through respiration process, ATP is released. Before we look at the mechanism of ATP releasing, let's look at the structure of the ATP molecule. What is the ATP molecule like? The full name of ATP is adenosine triphosphate. It helps to understand about the structure of the molecule. All nucleotides contain in the ATP molecule, that is a nitrogenous base, a pentose sugar, and a phosphate group is the nucleotide structure in the ATP molecule. And ATP molecule is based on this nucleotide. ATP is sometimes described as phosphorylated molecule. When you phosphorylate a molecule, that means you add a phosphate, one or more phosphate group to it. ATP is essentially the DNA nucleotide with 2 extra phosphate group added on, making 3 in all. Adding the extra phosphate requires energy, particularly when the 3rd phosphate is added. As you can see in this slide, only 1 phosphate, the pentose sugar, and the adenine nitrogenous base is part of the ATP molecule. Let's look at the other structure that is in this slide. You can see that there are 3 phosphates, and the central 5-ring structure is the pentose sugar, and the above green labeled one, the adenine nucleotide or the nitrogenous base. So here you have the ATP molecule, a complete ATP molecule. A readily available energy for the cell is the ATP molecule. As a result, energy is stored in the ATP molecule when it becomes 3. And when the bonds that hold the 3rd phosphate in place are broken, the energy is released again. When the 3rd phosphate is removed from ATP, we are still left with a phosphorylated nucleotide. But this one has 2 nucleotides. It is adenosine diphosphate. At this time, when it is removing the last 3rd phosphate from the ATP molecule, it becomes ADP molecule. The phosphate group that is split off is usually written as PI, as a kind of shorthand to save the writing of this structure. It is shortly written as PI. That is inorganic phosphate, in other words. Notice that the diagram indicates that the energy to form ATP can come from sunlight or from the food. ATP is synthesized from energy obtained from the food molecule or energy originally coming from the sun. This is because ATP is formed in both photosynthesis and cellular respiration. ATP adapted to its role as an energy transfer molecule in cells. This is another point to give attention to this. Sunlight energy cannot be utilized directly by plants and by other organisms to drive the synthesis of protein or any other molecules. The same applies to energy held in a glucose molecule. These two energy sources must be used to produce ATP, that is the sunlight energy as well as the energy in the glucose molecule. They used to synthesize the ATP molecule, which is used to transfer the energy to the relevant cellular process. So here you can see that in this slide there is glucose molecule there, and this glucose molecule, when it broke down, it releases energy, and this combined with the ADP molecule, it produces ATP molecule. The ATP molecule again break down to make synthesis of molecules in the cellular process. That is, for instance, amino acids are converted into protein molecule. This process requires energy. All the life process requires energy. So that this is what we call it the coupled reaction, transfer of energy in a cell. So ATP is adapted to this role because it releases energy in a relatively small amount that are closely matched to the amount of energy required in many biological processes occurring inside the cells. Releases energy in a single hydrolysis reaction, so the energy can be released quickly. It is able to move around the cell easily, but cannot escape from the cell. Previously, we have said that energy is neither created nor destroyed. It exists. It transforms from one form to another, so that the energy is broken in ATP molecule. It produces ADP and inorganic phosphate. The energy released as serving the life process. So the structure of the ATP synthase. ATP is synthesized by an enzyme called ATP synthase. This is the structure of the ATP synthase. In this slide, it has a structure called embedded on the mitochondrial membrane. It has a rotor structure and condensing rod, catalytic knob, and the likes. So the concentration of the hydrogen ion outside the membrane and accumulates when it passes through the rotor. It spins out the rotor, and then this energy combining the ADP with inorganic phosphate, and finally it produces the ATP molecule. So in this structure, you can observe, or you can see the structure of the ATP synthase. Examples of processes that require energy from ATP. The synthesis of macromolecules such as proteins. Proteins and fats and other carbohydrates are, they release energy, and there is molecule synthesis, hormones, enzymes are synthesized. So this process requires energy. That energy is supplied from the ATP molecule. Active transport across plasma membrane. In a previous lesson in the cell biology, we have seen that the active transport process, that is the endocytosis and the exocytosis, so that the ATP molecule is important here for active transport of molecules across the plasma membrane. Conduction of nerve impulses. We have neurotransmissions are electrochemical conduction process. This requires energy. This energy is supplied by the ATP molecule that is released from the ATP, from the food molecule, or from the sunlight energy. And the initial reaction of respiration, that is a glycolysis process we call it. This also requires ATP molecule at its initial course. So here you can see the structure of ATP molecule. How ATP produced in a cell? We're gonna look at the mechanisms by which ATP produced in a cell, in a plant cell, in animal cell, in different cellular organisms. ADP and inorganic phosphate joining to form ATP, and this requires an input of energy. So always this is a circular or cyclic process. Energy releasing mechanisms and energy forming mechanisms are circular and cyclic process. So that when energy is broken down from the ATP molecule, it converted into ADP and inorganic phosphate. Again, when energy is supplied to the cell, these two molecules, ADP plus inorganic phosphate plus energy, this will later form the ATP molecule. So the formation of ATP involves an enzyme called Atp synthase. As you can see in this slide on the right side, it has two knobs, the rotor, and there are the rods connecting to it. Two knobs are there, upper and lower. So the catalytic knob is there. So this is the structure of the ATP molecule. Atp synthase is one of the membranes of mitochondria. It is found in the mitochondrial membrane, but it could be in a membrane of chloroplast also. How ATP is produced in a cell? Still, we further look at the process. When the rotor is made to spin by hydrogen ion passing through it, the energy of the spinning is used to activate sites in the catalytic knob that convert ADP and inorganic phosphate to ATP, as already I've mentioned earlier. So here you can see that when hydrogen ion concentration, when is a concentration gradient occurs, hydrogen outside highly accumulated and inside less, then from higher concentration to goes to lower through these pores, through this ATP synthase. Then it drives the ATP synthase, and this will combine ADP and inorganic phosphate, finally produce ATP molecule. In both photosynthesis and aerobic respiration, many of the reactions generate the hydrogen ions that will pass through the ATP synthase to produce ATP. This is the mechanism how a cell is producing the ATP molecule. There are again also how ATP is produced in respiration. There are two main pathways by which respiration can produce ATP. The aerobic pathway or aerobic respiration. This requires the presence of oxygen, and the anaerobic pathway, anaerobic respiration and fermentation. This can take place in absence of oxygen. So ATP production through the respiration process, there are two mechanisms: aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration and fermentation. These are the two ways how ATP is produced in the cell or in the process of respiration. How ATP is produced in aerobic respiration, that is in presence of oxygen. Now we can see this. A small amount of ATP is produced in a way that does not involve the ATP synthase molecule. Some process of energy releasing mechanism does not involve the ATP synthase molecule. In this time, small energy is released, and the method is called substrate level phosphorylation. In this process, another molecule such as phosphoenol pyravate, the substrate, is able to transfer a phosphate group directly to ADP without the involvement of ATP synthase. This time, ATP molecule is formed, and a little ATP molecule is released in this process of aerobic respiration. There is no ATP synthase involved and no inorganic phosphate in the phosphoenol pyravate process or phosphorylation process. The process is still catalyzed by an enzyme. Here the phosphoenol pyravate, it is catalyzed. It doesn't use ATP synthase, though it uses some other enzyme. It is just not ATP synthase. This process only produces a small amount of the ATP produced in aerobic respiration. In fact, it produces about 10% of the total ATP produced in aerobic respiration. So this process is producing a little amount of energy. That is the substrate level phosphorylation. At about 90% of the ATP produced in aerobic respiration is produced by ATP synthase by using this enzyme. Many of the reactions of this process are geared to producing the hydrogen ion that will spin the rotor as the ATP synthase molecule. Many different organic molecules can be respired. They are called respiratory substrates. However, glucose is the most commonly respired substrate molecule. How are hydrogen ions transferred from glucose to ATP synthase? The two molecules are important in this transfer process are the nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, or for short it is NAD, and the second one is the flavin adenine dinucleotide, FAD. These are very important molecules or coenzymes that are important in the transfer of the hydrogen ion to the rotor or to the mitochondrial membrane or to the chloroplast. Both are coenzymes and are capable of accepting the hydrogen ion. When this happens, the molecule have been reduced. NAD become NADH and FAD become FADH when they accept hydrogen ion. The reduced form of the molecule as NAD and FAD, or NAD reduced and FAD reduced. These molecules can release their hydrogen ion and become oxidized again. They release to the mitochondrial membrane, they become oxidized again. The hydrogen ion can then be used to turn the rotor of ATP synthase. What are the stages of aerobic respiration of glucose? Here, there are different stages of aerobic respiration of glucose. There are 4 stages in the aerobic respiration of glucose. These are glycolysis, the link reaction, the Krebs cycle, the electron transport, and chemiosmosis. Except glucose, the glycolysis process, the first process, all the 3, the remaining, that is the link reaction, the Krebs cycle, the electron transport, and chemiosmosis are taking place in the mitochondria, inside the mitochondria. but glycolysis only takes place in the cytoplasm. So separate processes takes place. Overall, the 4 stages are aerobic respiration processes. And the first stage, glycolysis, takes place in the cytoplasm. It does not take place inside the mitochondria because of 2 reasons. One, the glucose molecule cannot diffuse through the mitochondrial membrane. It is a medium-sized membrane and is not lipid soluble. If you remember in the cell biology, substance to cross the plasma membrane through diffusion, it must be a small molecule and it should not be charged and it should be lipid soluble. So glucose molecule should not fulfill this criteria so that it cannot pass through the mitochondrial membrane. The second reason is there are no carrier proteins to transport the glucose molecule across the membrane. Like the channel protein, the carrier proteins are not responsible to transport the glucose molecule across the mitochondrial membrane. So that because of 2 reasons, the glycolysis process takes place inside the cytoplasm. Here you can see the mitochondria and the process of the aerobic respirations. The 3 of the processes are takes inside the mitochondria. Outside in the cytoplasm, the glycolysis. Glucose is broken down into 2,3 carbon molecule, that is the pyruvate. So you can see here how these molecules are carrying out these 2 processes. So glycolysis, literally glucose splitting, in other words, glucose splitting process, results in glucose being converted into a smaller molecule containing only 3 carbon atoms, pyruvate. The pyruvate can enter the mitochondria, and so all the stages that take place inside the mitochondrion. Here the 3 stages are shown in this mitochondrial membrane inside the mitochondria. The link reaction, the Krebs cycle, the electron transport, and chemiosmosis takes place inside the mitochondria. And the only process that takes place in the cytoplasm is the glycolysis process. What are the stages of aerobic respiration of glucose? In the link reaction, pyruvate then converted into 2 carbon compound into a cycle of the reaction, that is the Krebs cycle, named after Sir Hans Krebs, who discovered the reaction involved. So Krebs cycle is named after this scholar, that is Hans Krebs. Both these stages take place in the fluid matrix of mitochondria. In all 3 stages, glycolysis, the link reaction, and Krebs cycles, hydrogen atoms are transferred to NAD to produce reduced NAD. The Krebs cycle also produces reduced fat. These molecules later release their hydrogen atom or protons or hydrogen ions and the electrons in the final stage of the aerobic respiration. So the electron passes along a series of molecules called an electron transport chain. So here the protons are used in the chemiosmotic synthesis of ATP. They spin the rotor of the ATP synthase enzyme located in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. Eventually, the protein, the hydrogen ion, and the electrons will combine with oxygen to form water molecule. Where the stages still were on the stages of the respiration of glucose. Without the oxygen, this cannot happen as there is nothing at the end of the electron transport chain to accept electron. The electron transport chain grinds to halt, and so does the production of ATP by ATP synthase. So oxygen is very important to accept the final electron in this process in the aerobic respiration. Because it is oxygen dependent, this method of production of ATP is called oxidative phosphorylation. The link reaction, the Krebs cycle, and the reaction of the electron transport chain all depends on the presence of oxygen. None of these occur in anaerobic respiration. Glycolysis can take place in the absence of oxygen, and it is only energy releasing process in anaerobic respiration. And student, now this is time for revision of some questions, and you listen attentively to these revision questions on the part that is revised to you. Question number 1. Which of the following molecule is known as the energy currency of the cell? A. Glucose. B. Starch. C. Fat. D. ATP. If your answer is D, you are correct. Question number 2. The final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain during aerobic respiration of eukaryotic cells: A. Water. B. Oxygen. C. Carbon dioxide. D. NADP. If your answer is B, you're correct. Question number 3. Which of the following defines ATP? A. Adenine plus adenosine plus phosphates. B. Adenosine plus ribose sugar plus double phosphate. C. Adenine plus ribose sugar plus triplet phosphates. D. Nitrogen plus sugar plus monophosphate. If your answer is C, you are correct. Question number 4. Which one of the following steps in a cellular respiration can take place in the absence of oxygen? A. Krebs cycles. B. Glycolysis. C. Link reaction. D. Electron transport chain. If your answer is B, you're correct. Question number 5. Which of the following pair of organelles are concerned with the energy transformation? A. Chloroplasts and vacuole. B. Mitochondria and nucleus. C. Nucleus and nucleolus. D. Mitochondria and chloroplasts. If your answer is D, you are correct. Dear students, this is all we have for today. I hope you find this revision important to you. Till next time, goodbye.